what makes you think AI is not going to follow a similar path?
Well, I think AI might replace BIM. BIM systems are big and clunky, and they're not particularly user-friendly. Getting people to use them just because you can't start from scratch. You have to know how the system works. You need to understand layers and how they operate. And
Gerard, welcome to the podcast.
yeah, no, thank you, Harry. It's good to be here. Yeah.
So, Gerard, please could you introduce yourself for our audience?
The short version, I'm Australian. I did an economics degree and worked as a business economist for a decade or so, and ended up working for an industry association here called the Property Council of Australia, which is exactly what it says on the label. They represent major investors in property. And I got recruited from there to become the chief economist for a government inquiry into inclusive tendering in the construction industry, which ran for a couple of years. Was this incredibly intense introduction to issues about construction. And it was a big inquiry. I was headed by a judge. There's a research department with over a dozen people. We did surveys of projects, huge 20 major projects, and surveys of subcontractors and suppliers and everything, and I got to be involved in all of that and read it all, and I just found it really interesting, to be honest. I didn't have any appreciation beforehand of how complex the industry is, because we look at it from the outside and sort of think of it all as putting bricks together, right? One thing on top of another. And when the inquiry finished, it was in the middle of a recession in Australia at the time, and I got offered a job at the University of Technology in Sydney, and I thought, do that for a couple of years, try to see what that's like. And a few decades later, I finished up my career as an academic after having gone from Sydney to London to UCL. I just found that I still have that original interest that started during that government inquiry. I still find the industry interesting. I think the issues are complex. And my interest as an economist was in two main areas. I'm really not a macro economist. I'm an industry economist, which means I've always been interested in issues around economic growth and how industries develop over time and the role technology plays in development. And that's combined with a parallel interest in industry policy. What can governments do to facilitate development, growth, better outcomes, so on and so forth. So I've just been kind of plugging away on that now for many decades. And when I retired from academia a couple of years ago, I didn't really see any reason to stop. I'm still just as interested in that now as I was then. And so I started the Substack as a way of just sort of being able to keep reading and writing without actually having to go through the agony of publishing in academic journals and stuff like that, which is really a process I'm quite happily not engaged in any longer.
Absolutely, and those are some of the articles we want to talk to you about today. And I think what's clear throughout your writing is you've long been a real advocate for the industry. I'd say most people perceive it as perhaps somewhat backwards and lacking in innovation, but you seem to argue that has a long tradition of innovation and hidden innovation plays a big role in construction. Why do you think construction might have a marketing issue?
Oh, yeah. I think there's two reasons for that. Two primary reasons. The first is that what people see is site work and site workers. And there is these enormous range of different construction sites, but some of them are terrible. they're really poorly arranged, they're poorly managed, they're messy. They look, you've got the thunderbox out the front type thing, and you have piles of materials lying around. It's just blokes in, big blokes in high vis, shirts sort of standing about, not appearing to do very much. It's I know that it's not representative, but there's enough of that around that it really does, I think, affect people's impression of the industry. And that's compounded by the endless media stories about dodgy builders and buildings that fall down and, issues with buildings in general, defects and stuff like that you get. So there is a genuine image problem that the industry has, and that is, while it's completely unfair, it might only be, it might be the 80-20 thing, might only be 20% of sites and 20% of people that create 80% of that image. And the other 80% of sites, particularly the big commercial sites, very professionally managed. They're often very clean these days. It's all just in time delivery. It's all pretty sophisticated stuff, but people don't see that. So it's the impression. So it's very much about the impression that people get, which I think is not the whole story. And that leads into the second point, which is the difference between the narrow industry, the site work that's done, that's typically what people think of as construction, and then the wider view of the industry, which would include architects and engineers and the quantity surveyors and all the other professionals, project managers, and all the professional service providers, who are just as much a part of the industry. But of course, you don't see them on site, and you don't see them as part of. They're not seen as construction in the same way, And I used to ask students, in our undergraduate quantity survey, course, why are you doing quantity surveying? And often the answer was because they knew someone who was already a quantity surveyor or someone in the industry who recommended it to them. It's not something people think, oh, look, I'm going to become a quantity surveyor.
Yeah.
A lot of people think I'm going to become an architect because it's a thing. And similarly with, I think with engineering, you choose. There's lots of different versions, mechanical, civil, electrical, chemical, right? They're all different versions of engineering. But to work in construction, you've really got to be choosing civil engineering. And that's only one of that range of options that people have, So you've got, you're competing against people that want to become aerospace engineers or robotics engineers or whatever, electrical engineers. So it takes... So the wide view of the industry includes all these professionals, but they're not often seen as being a part of the industry that the same as the site workers are.
Yeah. Okay. And within that then, how do you think that the industry overcomes those barriers in terms of bringing innovation to the forefront and maybe optimizing on that 80-20 that you mentioned there?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be making $1 million as a consultant around the world. I mean, it's not. There is no simple answer to that one.
Yep.
In reality, the solution really is more exposure for school kids. Careers fairs and careers advisors and stuff. And that would include trades. I think having people that like working with their hands or problem solving or being outside rather than in an office, construction is a really attractive option for them. But you've got to know what the pathways are. And that's not obvious either. Sometimes if you're thinking, what am I going to do if I'm going to work in the construction industry? If you want to be a plumber or electrician or a carpenter, that's kind of straightforward. But if you want to be a professional, you want to go to university and study something, that's much harder. I can tell you a story on this actually with UTS, where we had a Bachelor of Construction. We could kind of do construction management or quantity surveying as the kind of two options, construction economics. And a few of my colleagues were very, very keen to rebrand the degree into a construction project management degree. And I was really sceptical about this. I didn't, why would that make much difference to our enrolments and so on? And after a battle with the university hierarchy and bureaucracy that went on for many years, eventually we got agreement to do that. The year after we changed the name, this is just the name of the degree, nothing else changed, right? The year after we changed the name of the degree from a Bachelor of Construction to a Bachelor of Construction Project Management, applications doubled.
Wow, that's interesting.
Just bang. And it's because people want to be project managers.
Sure.
And it was identifiable. They could relate to that. It was a clear pathway, professional pathway that differentiated the degree from the trade pathway, and it was just great. And I think that's really a good example. Really, it's labeling is part of the issue.
It's really interesting you mentioned that, because I think you highlighted a little bit of the aspect that construction doesn't have like a lot of, let's say, social clout, right? It's not like sexy in the more traditional terms. And then you mentioned how, like, okay, when you make it sound sexy, more formal, like construction and project management, people kind of have a different perception of it.
And
But I actually,
a lot more women as well.
right, and a lot more women, interesting.
Mm.
But I actually think it's, to be a little provocative, I actually think the problem is that the trades don't attract as much. And I think that's ironic, because if you look at also how society typically works, like society tends to give social clout to financial reward more often than not. And actually people in the trades, like you can earn like a pretty good living. Frankly, I think people in the trades earn probably much more on average than an architect. But an architect is much more sexy, right? Than a tradesperson. But you could argue a tradesperson probably has a much more rich material life guaranteed than an architect, where there's extreme oversupply.
Yeah, and limited jobs, limited number of
and
jobs. And
limited jobs, exactly.
No, it's exactly right. And that's the school thing. One of the things, I don't know about in the UK, but in Australia, in some of the high schools now, you can actually start a trade stream, an apprenticeship, while you're still at school. So you can combine your last couple of years of school with the first bit of your apprenticeship. It's not offered in every school. And I don't even think it's offered in every state in Australia, because we have state-based school systems. But in New South Wales, we certainly have that. And that, I don't have any numbers on that one, but anecdotally, that seems to be working quite well. And I think that's a really good option for kids, because it gives them a chance. You can kind of try it and see if you like it, type thing.
Yeah.
And we in all honesty, we've tended to overemphasize going to university for people. I mean, there's getting a average degree from a lower tier university is not going to, for the vast majority of graduates, won't be a great career move, because of the oversupply. There's a problem. Like architects are a good example of that. And it's not. I'm not having a go at the universities. I think the quality of teaching is pretty consistent across all universities, because most academics are pretty dedicated to what they do. But it is just really hard if you've got these thousands of people graduating with generic commerce degrees or business degrees or architecture degrees into a marketplace where there's just a limited number of jobs for those people.
Not sufficient demand to justify that supply.
Yeah.
Maybe to change gears a little bit, because you were mentioning how you're an industrial economist, right? And you're put a lot of focus on how does industry grow, especially with the adoption of technology? And Harry and I were going through your articles, and there's a lot of focus right now on AI, right? AI in construction, and you have a lot of
Yeah,
interesting
yeah.
articles on that. You have one article, The Four C's of Construction, and in that article, you tend to kind of argue that you think point solutions, AI solutions that adapt, target a very specific problem or be more likely to be adopted in construction rather than maybe industry-wide kind of transformation platforms. What makes you say
Mm.
that?
Oh yeah, it's a platforms versus points. It's a it's there's elements, different elements in the argument there, and for partly it's cost. If you're a big contractor, you can afford to subscribe to a Bentley or an Autodesk. You get the full suite, and it's just part of your cash. It's part of your kind of you've got an investment strategy that includes paying for the subscriptions, but they're expensive. And so for medium and small size firms, that's hard for them to justify the cost. If you're not using it all the time, and particularly, if you're not being required to use something like Revit or BIM, then you're not going to incur the cost of running that just because you want to do it because it's a good thing to have. So that's part of the reason. But the other one is that the platforms often don't solve the problem for the firms. Every firm has got a slightly different structure, different ways of working. That sort of cultural thing. They're all similar, but they're all slightly different. And every firm's got its own pain points, depending on the sort of work they do, the people they've got. A lot of it is what the skills you've got available in the office, for the firm. And because the pain points are different for different firms, point solutions are actually a good option. They're not they're relatively cheap. They're not necessarily cheap, but they're relatively cheap compared to a platform. The learning curve is often not all that great because it's very specific. So you can get it, and some of the software now is actually pretty good, particularly the stuff that's genuinely AI enabled. So it links ChatGPT or something similar to a estimating program or to a program that does workflows. So you don't have to learn how to code or how to do anything particularly technical. You can ask it questions. It can process documents. It can read plans. And those sorts of capabilities, I think, are really useful for firms. But they're very specific. They're not. It doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't manage the company. It doesn't manage the project in the way the big platforms aspire to do. And I think it's a really good entry point for firms where they've got limited resources. Not a lot of cash. They don't have a lot of capital to spend, to invest every year, spare capital. And they don't have particularly highly skilled or highly qualified staff in many cases, or very limited numbers of skilled staff. So the successful. My view is that there's a lot of the successful firms in the sort of the AI software type space are going to be the ones that get the entry points right for firms. Identify the problem, solve that problem really well, and then scale from there.
But isn't that counter to what you just said? Because you highlight something that each firm has a pretty unique problem that they have, right? Maybe because of the background of the firm, the size of the firm, but construction is so varied, right?
Mm.
Then how can you identify a problem and scale if that problem is never necessarily consistent?
Oh,
That seems like a catch-22.
yeah, no, I see. Good point. But think about what's involved. Like every project has you've got to estimate. Like you're putting in bids, right? Tendering, right?
Sure.
or even just negotiating on. You've got to price work.
Sure, sure.
So that's estimating software. Some of that kind of AI enabled estimating software is pretty whizzy, to be honest. I mean, that seems pretty clever to me. Be able to read a plan with an AI, scan it and work out from that a list of quantities, or come up with a provisional kind of list of quantities and stuff. That seems like pretty useful. So, equally keeping track of logistics, deliveries and stuff. Entry and exit off the site. Who's coming on? Who's bringing what? Who's leaving? How long are they there for? That kind of stuff. That's perfect. That kind of stuff is absolutely perfect for AI.
Hmm.
It's just pattern matching. It's getting data and putting it into a form that makes it really accessible. If you're the project manager and you can turn around at the end of the day and say, how many people have gone on and off my site today?
Hmm.
And the system goes clunk, 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 130. Is that useful information or not? It's that and so that kind of stuff where you have a limited systems. You're not trying to re-engineer the industry with some massive piece of software, but you're just coming up with a piece of software that actually works really well, that calculates something like the number of doorknobs or the number of people or the number of crane hours that you're working, that kind of stuff. I think that's great. I think that stuff's going to be that can be transformational if you add it all together.
Mm. Fair.
Absolutely. So you mentioned quite a few point solutions there and a few examples. Based on your research, where do you see the biggest immediate wins for AI in construction? Would it be more towards pre-construction, the actual project management of the site, safety, or elsewhere?
Oh, I don't know. I honestly I'm not close enough to the site stuff. I could speculate about that, but I wouldn't. I'd hate to be I'd hate to be held to anything that I said. Um, Safety is the interesting one. I think there's going to be a lot of pushback against site monitoring, just because people don't like being observed 24 hours a
Mm.
day. And there are kind of a lot of issues, legal issues about that as well. On the other hand, there's some of the site safety systems. Really, all they do is monitor movement rather than individuals. Some of them have a tag, and they know who you are and where you are, type stuff. But other ones, they just use visual capture, and they just monitor movement. Are you getting close to the machine? Are you getting close to the edge? Is there a void behind you? Type stuff. I can see that kind of working and being pretty widely picked up pretty quickly as well, because it doesn't have the kind of issues associated with privacy and individual recognition that some of the more kind of Kafkaesque or systems are offering. But if you were to ask me where I think it's going to have the big impact, I would say pre-construction at the early stages, and that's because it's mostly office work. It's already computer based,
Makes sense.
and so you've got people sitting there doing site plans, they're doing estimates, they're working out Gantt charts, they're doing scheduling, all that kind of stuff. And that's all computer based these days. So once the data problem is solved, so the big issue really is there's no standardized data available in construction. Everyone does it differently. Even in the same company, different projects will have different ways of recording data and stuff like that. So there's no standardized data. So that's going to make it really hard to do AI the same way as they do in manufacturing or other industries for that reason. Companies that want to go down this path are going to first have to figure out some way of actually recording all this stuff, letting the AI to work on. But in easily recognisable tasks, things like doing site layout options, looking at how most efficient way to lay out sites. You don't need a lot of data. You just need the site and you need the access points and the way you go. You start to figure it out from there. So yeah, I think stuff that people are doing on computers already. There'll be a steady flow of drip feed of AI capabilities going into those. Just like think about how Microsoft has done it with their Office suite. I don't know how often people use Copilot when they're working in Word or in Excel, but it's there. And every so often you go, oh, maybe it can help, and you just click on it and see what it does, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes
Sure.
it does help.
Yeah, but that technology is never going to be transformational, right? It's actually providing
It's
incremental
incremental.
gains.
Yes, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's the point. It is incremental. Yeah.
Sure.
Just interesting point there on the safety side. I think it makes sense on the pre-construction side, since the sort of infrastructure that you need in terms of computers is already there. On the safety side, are you seeing a lot of pushback from a data privacy standpoint? So certainly in the UK now, every site I've been to is face scanning entry. Are you seeing pushback within the Australian construction industry?
The unions won't have a bar of it
Right.
in
Okay.
Australia, and we have a very militant construction union that is very influential in the commercial, industrial, bigger projects, not so much residential, except for high rise, but they won't have a bar of it. No one's even talking about trying it. It's just not worth the agony. You know,
Interesting.
it's you know, it, so it might be a good idea, and something in Asia, I think it's probably already being used pretty widely because it's particularly in places like China, they've already got that system in place, right? It's happening anyway, but we don't have it here. Look, I remember back in the UK. This is going back, now, 6 or 7 years, and I was talking to a guy. And he said that his company had tried to give bracelets to workers, like tags,
Hmm.
so they could follow them around the site and they could see when they were on and off site and stuff. And they were amazed to discover that the tags never moved. And so what the guys would do is they'd come to work, they'd hang the tag up on the wall in the shed, and they'd go off to work on the site. They just weren't going to wear them. So yeah, there's a long way to go with this kind of stuff to get buy-in from people, and I think it's people. You got to work with people. Again, managers might really like the idea of being able to have face recognition on the gates, but if the workers don't like it, then you really is that really a hill to die on? For your company? Maybe there's better ways of trying to improve productivity than that.
Sure. You mentioned BIM earlier, but then you also mentioned how companies, for them to reap the full benefits of AI, they're going to have to figure out how to at least somewhat standardize data. But I think, again, if you're being provocative, then can you not argue that AI might just see the same trajectory of BIM, where 15 years ago BIM came out and people were extremely enthusiastic. They thought it was going to be really transformational for the industry. And now 15 years on, yes, I mean it's been adopted, but it's been adopted in a very dispersed and diverse way. And I would say people are not necessarily like universally bought into the concept even 15 years in. Like, what makes you think AI is not going to be follow a similar path?
Well, I think AI might replace BIM. To be honest,
Okay,
I
tell us
think,
more.
yeah, I think AI. You know, the the issues with BIM was always the learning curve. The BIM systems are big and clunky, and they're not particularly user friendly. And there's always been a bit of an issue about getting people to use them, just because you had you can't start from scratch. You have to know how the system works. You need to understand layers and how they operate, and so it's not something you can just. It's not like a spreadsheet, which is you can kind of the spreadsheet is just obvious what it does, and if you know the basics about adding and subtraction, you can actually do something with a spreadsheet, or you can use it to make lists, right?
Sure.
You know, so BIM's it's never been very user friendly. But what we're going to get now, or what we are getting now, are these AI agents. So with the thing about agents is that they're nested. So an agent does a particular thing. So you can increasingly they're voice controlled, a bit like Siri or Alex in the computer thing. So you can ask an agent to do something, like to inspect a plan, to look for clashes, and it will then work through a process one agent will go off and read the plan and produce lists of things. Another agent will then go through those lists and match them to something like the building code that they've got, and work out whether everything's compliant. Another agent can go through that list and see whether there's going to be clashes between things like the mechanical and electrical plans and the structure itself. So they're all doing something specific. There's no one single bit of AI that's doing all of that. And they hand off to it. And so it's like a sequence. The first one does the reading, the second one does the compliance, the next one does the clash detection, the last one actually goes through and looks at the coordination issues. And then the final one gives you a report. Now
I understand. You paint a vision of like agents being able to do multiple complex steps. I think this is my take at least. I think that they might come, but I think the contractual liability, also the incentives of contractors wanting to have more scope because that makes them capture more of the pie. I think such agentic systems are going to face a lot of, I think, structural challenges in construction that will make that kind of vision very hard to implement in practice. Because like let's think about the liability of a clash, right? Let's say you move something and then it's structurally no longer sound, then who takes the liability? Is it the contractor? Is the company that builds the agent?
We don't know, do we? It's a new
Exactly.
territory. No, I don't disagree. Look, there's a reason why so much litigation is associated with construction projects. But what I years ago, one of the big contractors, one of the guys working for them, said to me, the thing about contracts is that they only become important when something goes wrong.
Right.
I thought that sounds obvious. What do you think about it? Project goes well, no one really cares about the contract, right? Because things are working. Right? You're getting stuff done. That comes out of the ground. Defects are under control. The schedule's together. So the contract's really a secondary issue. But when something goes wrong, so they don't put enough Rio in the slab and it collapses, that's definitely going to end up in court. Similarly with many other issues that projects come across, because they involve time and money, the contract then becomes important because the way that the way the disputes are resolved depends on how the contract is framed, the conditions in the contract. So that's a long way of leading into the point that I'm trying to make about AI, where AI does not absolve anyone from responsibility. It's just a tool. So in the same way as if you're the designer and you don't put enough reinforcement in the slab, that's your mistake. You are obviously liable for that. If you're the builder and instead of pouring the concrete to the width that the slab is specified at, you shave it, right? Save a bit of money, boost your margin, and it starts cracking because it's not thick enough. That's clear. There's clear liability. These are all really common issues, right? But they're always
Hmm.
attributable to the responsible party. I don't think AI will make any difference to that. You have to sign off on things. So yes, you can get the agent to go and do all that work and to produce reports for you, but those reports then have to be given to a person,
Mm.
to a person who is going to take responsibility. So it doesn't absolve anyone from liability. I don't think, and I think that what. So this is the argument really that what AI is going to be doing is going to be working as like an intelligent assistant rather than as some kind of autonomous agent actor in their own right. Now, I absolutely think that's the case. I think the particularly in construction, in the kind of work we do, we're going to get a lot of assistance from AI in lots of different ways. It's going to help with logistics. It's going to help with planning. It's going to help with estimating and layouts, safety, all these sorts of things. But in every case, it's just an assistant. At
Right.
the end of the responsibility will always come back to the estimator, to the project manager, to the safety manager or coordinator, right? To the guy that's doing the logistics, a guy that organises the cranes and stuff, right? There's always going to be a person in the loop. Well, for a very long time, in certainly our
Yeah.
lifetimes.
But then what's your take on the fact that, like, humans, the way we work is to build expertise, we have to go through a lot of repetitive cycles of doing something, and that's how we learn about edge cases. That's how we effectively build that muscle memory. Now, let's take the estimator's example, right? An estimator is only as good often as their experience. So the more projects they've seen, that gives them a wealth of experience in terms of, okay, this is really going to take this amount of time. Now we introduce AI agents into the story. If AI agents start doing 80% of the work, and we say the last 20% is done by an estimator, currently we still have very experienced estimators in the, let's say, construction ecosystem, right? But then maybe 10 years time, these people are going to start becoming old enough to retire. But then the new people coming in, if they've lived and grown in a system, in a context where 80% of the work is now being done by AI, are they truly building that expertise to then be the human in the loop that takes the final decision of the 20%?
Mm. Sadly, we already have this problem. Okay, the example here is the RRCS. Right? So they've got these grades that you go through, estimator, senior estimator, commercial manager, commercial director type thing. Traditionally, they were 5 years between each step.
Okay.
Right, you'd work your way up, get all. So that's your point.
Is this a government? Sorry, this is an Australian government scheme. I'm just not familiar with
No,
it.
this is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. So
Oh, okay.
they're a
We
kind of
have it in the
industry
UK as
body
well.
in the UK,
Gotcha.
around the UK, Australia, sort of Anglophone countries. They have colleges for different types of professions, construction professionals. But in their estimating group, they've had these kind of steps that you go through over your career. And eventually you become a commercial director after 20 years of experience, right? What's happening now is you're doing each of those steps in 1 or 2 years, not 5 years. So people are going from being just a junior estimator to being a commercial manager in the same amount of time as it used to take to go from being a junior estimator to a senior estimator. And it's not because they're getting better experience or they're getting better at doing their job. It's because there are fewer people with that recruitment problem that we've got there. But it's also because the level of expertise that's being used is changing as well. It's not just about experience, it's about that ability to process information and solve problems, work with people, and know your clients, know the work you're doing, as it were. So I don't disagree. I actually think you're completely right. I think there is a real issue here that we're getting a lot more people are becoming taking more senior roles in the industry with much less experience than we traditionally had. That's actually what's happening though already. It's not something that's going to happen. It already is happening. And that's a reflection of the recruitment problem to a large extent. You have a lot of people who are retiring out of the industry because they're in their 50s and 60s or 70s even, and we're just not, the pipeline of new talent coming through is just very limited. Yeah.
Then to counter that, given the ability of technology and how it's improving year on year, is the quality of the output dropping then? To say
I have no idea. You'd
yeah,
know more than I would, to be honest.
yeah.
I'd be interested in your opinion on that, to be honest.
There's arguments for and against, and it's a complex issue. I think it's probably outside the scope of this conversation, but
it's a very diplomatic answer. Yes, that's right. Yeah, but it is hard. I mean, if you go back a couple of generations, it was all about on-the-job training. This applied to back in the old days, an architecture degree was actually quite short. It was only a couple of years. It's like a drafting degree. Originally, how do you actually do the drawings, and then you go to work in an architect's office to learn how to be an architect, and then slowly but surely the degrees expanded to become this sort of 4-year plus postgraduate study type thing that we have now, with a lot of other things involved. But originally it very much was hands-on stuff. Quantity surveying is a very similar thing as well. That was another area where you really learned how to do it in the office and working with QSs, experienced QSs. That I think that applies to a lot of the professional services in construction. Whereas these days, much more of the training is done at university, and then what employers want is employable graduates, or graduates that are ready to work when they come out of the university, because for a whole range of reasons, construction companies no longer do a lot of training internally, which because we've kind of lost that, I think, in the industry. And that's just what's happening. I mean, you can't unwind that now. That's already done. That's a change that's already happened. We could improve the training in lots of ways, or the education. There's lots of things we could do to make that work better. But we're not going to go back to the older system, which was much more like apprentice based than we have today. Yeah.
I think we've kind of touched upon the fact that the system now is no longer apprentice based, but I was also reading one of your articles around like the changing composition of employment in construction. And it's interesting, like you mentioned, there's a lot more people coming into the industry now that come from this most postgraduate kind of path. A lot more people that are like maybe engineers or have gone through like this construction project management kind of degrees and enter construction. But the people in the field necessarily don't haven't seen a change in the backgrounds, right? So isn't this potentially also causing a problem where like the gap between this more digitally savvy, maybe more formally educated back office is becoming wider from the field, and therefore that has like a new set of problems that are emerging?
Mm. Oh, mm. A new set of problems. I mean, there's always been tension between the office and the site workers. That's not a new thing at all. The, the point about the composition is that the only about 10% of the industry in Australia, the UK, and the US would qualify as unskilled workers.
Okay.
That's the first point, right? Then there's another big chunk, 30-40%, who are the trades people, but they're qualified, and a lot of them have actually think of a crane driver. Like, no one gets to just work, climb up a tower crane and play around with the controls, right? Apprentices do 3-4 year apprenticeships, to become electricians and carpenters and stuff like that. So, they're all skilled. But the big change that's been happening at the other end, at the kind of the office end of the business, is a big reduction in clerical workers, and they're being replaced by professionals, by managers of various sorts. So whereas in the past you might have had a bookkeeper that was looking after a lot of the delivery stuff, the invoicing and the logistics type stuff, now you've got a logistics manager. And there's a safety manager. We didn't, again, even 20 years ago, we didn't have safety managers, or they weren't as common as they are now. BIM managers, right? There's a profession that didn't exist until 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And every major company's got one. And they've often got a little hierarchy of BIM managers as well, the senior guy and then the junior, things like that. So they're all managed. So the big change has been in this management strata in the industry, and they've become a much larger. Their share of the total employment has doubled over the last couple of decades. So I think yes, it's much more professional than it used to be, and yes, a lot of that is computer based as well. That's the point we were talking about before. So that's why a lot of those people are already kind of digitally enabled in various ways, which is why they're going to be able to start to incorporate more of the AI type stuff in what they do. Whether it's going to become more, I don't know. I think we're a long way from replacing a lot of site workers with anything. Like humanoid robots are on the horizon, but they're not going to be on construction sites in their thousands anytime soon, I don't think.
Yeah.
And to bring it back to that sort of technology diffusion, in your article you highlighted how technology diffusion in construction is complex due to the sort of highly fragmented nature of the industry. If this is true and diffusion is slow and the margins, as we know, are typically thin, does that make construction as a whole a poor sector to innovate and invest in?
No. So there's two parts to that. Again, another parts of the answer, but most of the innovation in construction over the last few decades has come from the suppliers. Right? Think about tower cranes. If you go back a few decades, tower cranes could lift a few tons. Now we've got cranes that can lift 1,000 tons. Right? How does that happen? Right? That is actually innovation, bit by bit, better materials, right? Better ways of constructing them, better ways of anchoring them. That's what innovation looks like. But we don't. But it's not obvious. The cranes are just there, right? You put in a crane that's got twice the capacity as an old one, it still doesn't look a lot different. So no one thinks, "Oh wow, that's an amazing new crane." Right? No one's looking at the rated lift capacities of these things. Trucks are the same. The great example we use in Australia with mining trucks is in the 1960s we had a mining truck that could carry 40 tons of iron ore. Right, the trucks today carry 400 tons. Right, they are monsters. I mean, they're really, really big. We're not going to have any. There's never going to be a truck that carries 4,000 tons. Right, it's just never going to happen. We've actually reaching the limit of the practical size of these machines. It just doesn't become cost effective to make them a lot bigger than they are. But to get from that 40-ton capacity to 400-ton capacity in these trucks has taken best part of 60 years of incremental innovation. And the same, so you could think about this in terms of things like waffle pods, for residential construction. That's something that's come along that slowly but surely has taken over a lot of the residential construction industry. Gyprock drywalls for interior linings is another good one. That's taken 20 or 30 years to become established. We're seeing the same similar process at the moment with CLT, cross-laminated timber building. Right, it's been around for 20 years, like since it was sort of invented in Europe. It was only really about 10 years ago that the Germans and the Scandinavians kind of figured out how to automate the production processes. Companies like Homag and stuff got their act together. Now it's becoming a mainstream building material. It's being used in lots of different ways. Not so much for whole buildings, but lots of parts of buildings now are built using CLT. So a lot of what we do on the side is driven by the materials we use. My favourite example of this, to be honest, it goes right back to the end of the 19th century when we started using reinforced concrete and glass. Right, so all of a sudden we had these new materials, steel reinforcement, and concrete that allowed a new way of building. That was when we started to move away from brick and pier construction, so we could actually build iron frame buildings and concrete slabs and all the other stuff, and sheet glass for facades. So that whole international style of building that took over the world after the beginning of the 20th century was all about using those new materials and finding out how to use them. But it actually took a few decades to get all the bits and pieces in place. The concrete pumps, the first concrete pumps from memory, weren't invented until the 1930s, maybe the 20s or 30s. So it took a long time for all the infrastructure to be put into place to use those materials. And then the way we put up buildings changed, and we started to use things like tower cranes that developed their own trajectories. So that was the great that was actually the first of the great transformations in building. We've kind of been building pretty much the same way for centuries until then, with brick and timber, tile and glass. And then all of a sudden we had this new stuff, concrete and steel. We could do steel frame buildings, we could do concrete slabs, whole elevators turned up, you could put up in high rises. And so as those materials came along and the industry learned how to use them, it changed the way the industry operated, it changed the way it worked. And that really has been the story in a much smaller scale for the last 50 years as well, as we've seen all these new technologies come along that have changed the way we work. Things like CLT and prefab, the use of lifts, internal hoists, for buildings, the way that we do the interior and exterior walls, like facades. Facades were modular these days. And that's, people don't think of that as prefabrication, right? But a building facade is actually a classic example of prefabrication because it's all just done off site and then bolted into place on the site itself, right? So all this stuff happens. It's all happening constantly, but it's all pretty incremental. It's not that big breakthrough stuff that you kind of associated with innovation or we see with in other industries.
But then, as a final question before we close, if you're trying to be cynical, yes, the industry has seen a number of incremental innovations regularly, be adopted over time. But then the overarching story is that construction has had a flat, if not negative, productivity growth. So, as an economist, how do you explain it to yourself then? Because those two arguments seem to be countering each other.
Oh yeah, productivity. Look, that's a whole other program. We'll do that another day. But just the short answer is that we're not measuring it very well. So, but productivity is about measurement, inputs and outputs, right? Um, so when we measure the inputs, we actually, if you actually look at the ratio, if you look at the number of people employed on site, the amount of work delivered on site, the ratio has been going down steadily for decades. It takes fewer and fewer people. You can see this, or you will have seen this in your own experience, right? It takes fewer people. So why is productivity, why is measured productivity not reflecting that? Right? The increased use of power tools and heavy equipment, right? We've got forklifts on site now. We've got all this lifting and hoisting stuff which didn't exist 20 years ago. So there's something missing in what we're measuring on the output side. We're not capturing changes there. So the easy answer is we're not capturing quality changes. The computer graph, the change in price per digital widget is all about quality change, not about the cost of computers, right? It's about the increasing performance of computers. We have no equivalent measure for construction for buildings. We don't really know, how do you measure the quality of a building? Has it got more rooms? Has it got more walls? So that's part of the answer. The second part of the answer is the prefabrication element. That a lot of the value added, in economics, what we measure is the value added. We're asking how many people, how many hours worked for how much value added is created. And in construction, the vast majority of the value added is actually off-site, whether it's by the people in the office doing the professional work or by the suppliers who are making the facades or the drywall or making the concrete, precast elements, or simple stuff. You go back a while and electrical cables came in individual strands. Right now you get multi cables; they're all put together. So you just put one cable in, it does everything, data, power, lights, all that kind of stuff. So there's all that value add is in the manufacturing. The on-site work is still just laying a cable, right? Whether it's one,
So you're almost saying like it's an unfair comparison because as construction has reaped from the benefits of productivity growth in the manufacturing sector. But then when you look at what you measure, the productivity growth of the manufacturing sector isn't being captured when you look at construction. And therefore, it's like you're not really doing a fair comparison.
That's a really nice way of putting it, actually, Andrew. Yeah, I think that's right. And the problem is, it's an economic issue that we measure value added.
Uh-huh.
And how do we create value added? It's the difference between the cost of inputs and the cost of the output. So with the increasing amount of off-site fabrication and manufacturing of components, then the amount of value-added work going on at the actual construction site is actually going down over time. Not because of the work's not more valuable, it's just because you're doing less and less adding to it. You're just installing. A lot of it's assembly and install work, which is not high value-added work. So we're just measuring. What we're measuring is a lot of effort, but we don't. It's not a good way of measuring productivity.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. I think certainly a podcast for another time. I think that's a whole other hour-long conversation.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that another day.
Gerard, thank you very much for your time and your insights. Just to close off, is there anything you want to share with our audience?
Well, I love the idea of your podcast. I really hope it's successful. By the way, it's you find an audience. No, that's the first thing. It's been great to talk. I guess I would just finish with the broader point that the industry's facing a lot of challenges. And one of the problems we have with dealing with this is going back to my policy stuff. One of the problems we have with trying to address all those challenges is we're not separating them out very well. To solve a policy or solve an economic issue or an industry issue, you can really only have one target at a time. And the problem we have is we talk about construction, but really it's a combination of residential building, the home building stuff. There's non-residential building, which is the commercial and institutional industrial stuff. And then there's civil engineering, the heavy engineering stuff. Then the issues are different in each of those sectors. And I think it's to try to come up with solutions that suit all three of those sectors simultaneously is just impossible. It's one reason why we've been floundering for so many years with trying to come up with ways to make the industry more productive or more efficient or better performing in whatever way it is. And we just need to really focus on what can we do about making house building better? What can we do about making non-residential building better? What can we do about making civil engineering better? And you get different answers to each of those questions. And governments just won't. Governments aren't listening to this. They keep, and we keep seeing these task forces and inquiries. And it's always into the construction industry, right? And that's a disaster. That's why it's not working. That's why these things don't work. So we need to get much more focus on the different sectors of the industry and have policies, or the industry should be developing proposals to take to government for policy options for each of those sectors, those specific sectors, and get away from the idea of trying to solve problems for the construction industry as a whole.
Super.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great message to close. Gerard, thank you very much for your time again, and enjoy.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Right, guys.
Thank you, Gerard.
Cheers.
We'll be in touch. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.